Hi, everyone, and welcome to Generation 180's Electrify Ride Week event, EV Batteries, Straight Talk Edition. If you're here to learn more about electric car batteries, then you're definitely in the right place. Today, we're joined with experts Jennifer Krill from Earthworks and Robert Titche from the Volkswagen Group. We're going to have a straightforward conversation around electric vehicle batteries. Thank you to both of our panelists for being here. Before we get started, I want to tell you quickly about Generation 180. We're a national nonprofit organization based in Charlottesville, Virginia, working to inspire and equip individuals to take action on clean energy. My name is Stuart Gardner, and I'm also joined by my colleague Blair St. Ledger Olson. And a special thank you to our team member, Nate McFarland, who's working behind the scenes to help support this event. Here's a quick look at the three major focus areas of Generation 180. We're working to flip the energy script, helping us move from a narrative focused on how big the climate problem is to a story focused on where we're going, a world powered by 100% clean energy, a story that says we can do this and we all have a role to play. We focus on individuals not because it's all on our shoulders, it's not, but because certain behaviors and technologies not only help fight climate change, but also help build the political will we need to get big system level changes. We lead two major campaigns, Solar for All Schools, which just released their Brighter Futures report, and Electrify Your Ride for EVs. Solar and EVs are clean energy solutions proven to address two of the largest sources of CO2, emissions from electricity generation and transportation. As part of our Electrify Your Ride campaign, we host educational events like this one, where people can learn more about EVs. This week is full of online events that are great for EV owners, EV advocates, and the EV curious alike. We have sessions that will dive into EV conversions, workplace charging, EV policy, expanding access to EVs, and much more. There's trivia night, happy hour, and we're even giving away an electric bike. So drop in for a few sessions or stay for all 13. It's all free, it's open to everyone. So let's get started, but a few quick housekeeping items first. Because of the number of people joining us today, all of event attendees have been put on mute. Please use your Q&A, not the chat, if you want to submit any questions. We'll try to get to them, as many of them as we can in the next hour. So without further ado, let's hear from our guests. Robert, do you want to kick us off?
Oh, sure, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
and
awesome.
see you.
Yeah. Oh boy. Oh, that's a strange side, right? Yeah, thanks for having me, Blair and Stuart. My name is Robert Titche. I am in Germany right now. I was started with Volkswagen in 2006 and working on the first batch of battery design and how to work and disassemble batteries, and then in the production, how to assemble batteries in that way. What is the safety procedure within the battery? What are cells all about? How do you adjust cells to the proper use in the vehicle, and so on. And the first launch of the vehicle was in 2010 with the Touareg hybrid, and later on the Jetta hybrid, XL1, which is a very low consumption two-door vehicle, two-seater, and used the chance to work on a project called Twin Drive in 2011, where we had the chance to take the car as an auxiliary for your house. So you can actually plug in your car into your house and use the vehicle battery to power your HVAC or your microwave and your TV and whatnot. And then introduce all the tech and all the knowledge we had back in those days in 2013, and the first batch full EV from Volkswagen in Europe, called the e-up, and then later for us in the US in 2015 for the e-Golf. And then it was an ongoing scenario where we had the chance to design the plug-in hybrid version, Passat and Jetta for the European countries, A3 e-tron for us in the US and Canada. And then I took a chance to switch the pond and go to California in 2017 and working with Electrify America on the charging setup in the US and Canada. And then on the battery operations, what happens if a battery's gone wrong for whatever reason? Is there a repair process, repurposing, recycling, and so on? So that is a huge field that still keeps me busy. And as of now, I'm working out of Germany. So I left California in April, and then working out of here for now. can't wait to come back.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert. Jennifer, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Jennifer Krill. I'm calling in from California, and it's a bit hazy and smoky today. So Robert, you might be happy you're sticking around in Germany at least for a couple more months.
Okay.
So I'm the executive director of Earthworks. I want to thank the team at Gen 180. Thank you all for having us, and it's great to be on this in this discussion with Robert. It's always good to work with people who really know what they're doing. What I bring to this panel is Earthworks' 30+ years experience supporting communities on the front lines of extractive industries in the U.S. and around the world. We're very worried about the impacts of climate change, oil and gas extraction, and that's been a big focus of our work. And we also work on mining, working to reform policies. Like in the United States, mining is governed by a law that was passed in 1872, which is just as outdated as it sounds. And in recent years, we've seen a significant uptake in demand for mined minerals such as copper, nickel, lithium, cobalt, and other minerals that are being described as critical for the energy transition. And EV and renewable energy demand is, as we know from a climate perspective, critical. But what's concerning is if it's being used as a justification to expand mining in places like the salt flats in Argentina and Chile, the lithium mine that's on my introduction slide here, in places like Alaska, in the headwaters of the largest remaining salmon fishery in the world, in coastal and rainforest regions in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, even mining the depths of the ocean. We think there must be a better way, and very excited to be here today to talk about that. You want me to go on a little more, Stuart?
Yeah, let me jump in real quick with our questions. Jennifer, that is a fantastic intro. Robert, you as well. And I think that actually sets us up really well to dive into our Q&A. I mean, and you hit the nail on the head, Jennifer. We're here to have an honest conversation about the concerns surrounding EV batteries and what we as EV enthusiasts can do to advocate for change while still moving forward with an electric transportation future. So without keeping us from our very lengthy list of Q&A, we're going to get to everyone's questions as quickly as we can. I want to give the audience a chance to have a bit of a level set, and I'm hoping, Jennifer, that you can help us with that. So Nate, if you could actually bring those slides back. Sorry, false alarm. Jennifer, in the simplest terms possible, what are the legitimate concerns surrounding EV battery technology?
Right. Well, there are concerns that I hope Robert will cover in more detail about recycling and end of use. My expertise and biggest concern is at the sourcing, the point at which the minerals are mined and manufactured into the batteries that we know that we need in order to drive this EV revolution, that we know that we need for greenhouse gas purposes. So one thing to keep in mind is that mining is one of the most carbon intensive industries in the world. Metals mining is responsible for 10% of global energy related emissions. So we still have to be very mindful of the greenhouse gas footprint when we're talking about mining. And there are other threats. There are threats to ocean health. There are mines, in particular nickel mining, where we're concerned about the practice of dumping the mine waste directly into the ocean, directly onto coral reefs, directly into areas that are the nurseries for fisheries that people depend on. We're also very concerned about the impacts of mining on frontline communities and ecosystems. Areas of high biodiversity that happen to have some minerals underneath them are at severe risk. Mining can threaten biodiversity through habitat destruction and ecosystem fragmentation. It can be responsible for a tremendous amount of air pollution. Actually, on my next slide, there's a powerful illustration from just last January 2019 of the threat of another threat from mining, when the tailings dam, the impoundment that contains all of this mine waste, collapses. For a frame of reference, to make a single gold ring, you generate 20 tons of mine waste. When you add that up successfully over all the minerals that we demand and for all of society, you end up with a tremendous amount of mine waste. And the waste is placed back in an impoundment, or a shorthand for dam. What happens with the dam collapses? In January 2019, at the Brumadinho mine, which is an iron steel, produces the steel makings of steel, iron, and other minerals. We had a dam collapse that killed 250 people in Brazil. There was a dam collapse 6 years ago of mine waste in British Columbia that is now having lasting impacts in the Fraser River salmon fishery, which is going to have tremendous problems for that area's economy into the future. There are human rights abuses, and there are often disproportionate impacts on indigenous peoples, because mining is often in pretty remote areas, which is where oftentimes you find indigenous communities. So there's a severe overlay of impacts on indigenous peoples and access to the biodiversity and freshwater uses. So these are severe concerns, and let me just be clear, we support the transition to renewable powered energy. I'm not here to say that renewable power energy future is inappropriate. I'm here to say that we need to demand a transition that is just and equitable, that doesn't harm communities, that doesn't harm ecosystems through increased mining impacts. This is a real opportunity moment. So I gave you the problem so that we can talk about the opportunity.
Thank you, Jennifer. And it's a serious conversation. Oftentimes we'll hear things like that, and I feel like internal combustion vehicles, because they've been around for so long, they often don't get the same level of scrutiny. I'm wondering, for example, no one ever asks, what happens to all the oil when you change your car's oil every 3,000 miles. I'm wondering, how do we compare those problems compared to traditional ICE vehicles? Any sense on that, Robert or Jennifer?
I can speak to that, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So yes, perfectly right. The questions are usually raised, and ICE vehicle never had to answer in that way. So you put it perfectly right. The question was where the oil is gone has never been part of any survey. We make so many assumptions with the combustion engine vehicle because our parents taught us so, because the technology is about 100 years plus old. So the EV now gets swamped with different questions in that fashion. That's the same level. The good thing is that the technology in an electric vehicle is way more simple than in a combustion engine. You don't have the transmission, you don't have the clutch, you don't have to have very high thermic resistible components, or as you know, oscillating and rotating masses with that. Vibrations and heat is always something you want to keep away from technology, because usually that wears them out. The beauty of electric vehicle is there's almost no vibrations and certainly no heat. So that's why the technology is destined to last very, very long. So there are some estimates out there, but yeah, that recycling for sure is just one end of the gap we need to talk about.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
Jennifer, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just agree with Robert completely. It's I think the important thing today is that we in the EV movement do not want to repeat the mistakes of ICE technology at every level. And that's part of why we're seeing automakers like Volkswagen come out with these spectacular new designs. But we want to make sure that that same ethic translates into sourcing as well.
Absolutely. So I want to pause for a second and ask a question that's on a similar topic, but we hear a lot, as Stuart said, we hear a lot of these criticisms, and I'm actually curious if the concerns we're talking about are actually limited to electric vehicles, or are there other parts of our lives that currently leverage this same technology or similar impacts? And Jennifer, I think we'll start with you.
It's interesting. The demand for new minerals for electric vehicles actually began with electronics. It began with the computers you're all talking to us on, or the phones that you're hearing us from. And the difference is that in order to power a car, you just need a lot more of these minerals and much bigger batteries. And so we began actually about 15 years ago. We had our first conversation with Tiffany and Company, jewelry company, which is jewelry is responsible for a great deal of gold consumption, more than any other industry. Less so for other minerals, but it's still significant. And so responsible sourcing for us is then the story scaled up to including electronics industry like Microsoft. We've been having dialogue with Apple and so many other companies, and now we've added automakers to the thread, and we're working with a project called the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, which includes these representatives from each of these industries who are concerned about responsible sourcing. So yeah, it's not unique to EVs. The inflection point is different. Demand for minerals for other supply chains is where it is. EVs is poised to grow. So now is the time to be having the conversation about EVs.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jennifer. You often hear about lithium batteries. That's what we always hear. Yeah, I feel like more you're hearing about cobalt. Robert, can you help us understand a little bit? How much lithium really makes up an EV battery? Is it cobalt that's the bigger component? What are those key elements that make up a battery?
Good question. So to speak on the idea, it comes with an electric vehicle. Yes, the electric vehicle has a lot of technology in it that is kind of new. In order to understand what kind of components we're already using in ICE vehicles, you got to know that this is usually not an iron engine. It uses alloys, it uses a lot of nickel in that way, sometimes chrome, sometimes manganese. So it really depends on what kind of engine you got there. So if you got your regular V8 engine, the camshaft usually and the crankshaft are very high durable compositions of different materials in that way. So it's already there. Maybe not in the high demand like in a battery, because that has less steel, but more nickel, more cobalt for sure, and more manganese. The trend is obviously going into a zero cobalt battery. So from the battery design, we're looking into different concepts, not only, like you said, Stuart, the regular term is lithium-ion battery, but quite frankly, less than 1% of the overall battery composition is lithium. So somehow the term stuck with everybody, and we call it lithium battery in that way, but that'd be fine. Lithium is an important material in that way. Today, it's usually lithium sulfur or lithium carbonate. The next gen for sure is going to be something with lithium oxygen in that way. So something where we have more reaction in the electrolyte, and then later on for sure something in the solid state. Every OEM, every car manufacturer is going into that direction. There will be another engineering challenges coming with the solid state, especially when you take the battery into the consideration of a vehicle, which is sitting in Death Valley at 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and maybe want to be supercharged. So a lot of heat is introduced into the battery. And the other way of the spectrum would be somewhere in Anchorage in the very low temperatures, and then you just leave it there idling charging. So those are the two extremes in that way.
Jennifer, do you have anything to add to that one?
I think, well, I think Robert, I'm not an engineer, so what Robert can describe about what's happening inside of the electric motor and battery is absolutely right on, and I can't speak to that. I have a slide I can show though. Can you give me that slide, Robert, on cumulative demand, or Stuart, on cumulative demand?
Yeah.
Nate, will you throw that up, please?
Or Nate? Whoever has the slides.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
So what I would add is that so we take what Robert's describing about what's going on in the mineral demand inside of the vehicle, what we need, what we have now and what we're using versus what we need and what we're transitioning to. And asked ourselves, how do we meet the climate need to transition from fossil fuels without replicating the mistakes of the dirty fossil fuel based energy system that we're seeking to replace? For example, California has set a 2035 target for ending the sales of internal combustion engines. That's great. Cumulatively, if we transition to 100% EVs, how much more mining do we need? Where are the flashpoints? And so my organization, Earthworks, we commissioned research from the Institute of Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, which is a shop that works both on fossil fuel extraction as well as mining extraction. And then there's a transition in this slide, if you could give that to me, Nate. So we looked at all of these minerals that might be needed, and the increase that would be needed if we achieved 100% EV transition or something approaching 100% EV transition. And then we looked at the places where we were going to be far exceeding existing demand. And that's why the three minerals, there might be one more transition, Nate. That's why the three minerals that we became the most concerned about really surfaced: cobalt, lithium, and nickel. It's not to say that the other minerals that we might source don't have, for EVs or internal combustion engines, don't have problems. It's just to say that these are the minerals where we know that demand for EVs and renewable energies are far going to exceed supply, and that's part of the reason why we came to focus more on batteries. These minerals, lithium, cobalt, and nickel, are the clean energy minerals of the greatest concern because of that projected supply shortage.
That's great. Well, it's great that there's groups thinking about this and helping point us in the right direction. And I think that brings up our next question that, Jennifer, I want to hand to you first. And that is, what are the solutions that we need to implement and to tackle these issues? What are the things that we should be thinking about, and that I particularly think your group does a really nice job of highlighting?
Well, we see this as a chance to make mining cleaner. The industry has this long, troubled track record of environmental destruction and human rights abuses, whereas companies powering our clean energy future are working to accelerate our passage towards a better future. And so in partnering, the mining activists concerned about mining, and partnering with the companies working to accelerate this transition, we think that we can help advance better practices in the mining sector. So our proposed platform centers on three major changes. The first, at the product design stage, when companies are working right now to develop battery design and vehicle design, minimize toxicity and maximize recyclability. Exactly what Robert's talking about. If you follow the story of lead acid batteries recycling, you'll see that there's some really rotten stuff in our history, some severe health impacts in places where lead acid batteries ended up before we were actively recycling, and in when recycling is done in ways that were irresponsible. So let's not repeat that history. Minimize toxicity, maximize recyclability. And that includes product sourcing as well as how end use is being managed. Second, where new mining must be done, it should be done with the maximum environmental and social standards. And Earthworks, my organization, has been working with these downstream users, Tiffany and Company, BMW, Microsoft. We've been working with the mining industry itself. We've been working with frontline community groups, First Nation women, against advocating for responsible mining. We've been working with labor unions, Industrial Global Union, United Steelworkers, to develop a robust, credible standard for best practices in mining for the whole spectrum of social and environmental impacts. And it's called the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or IRMA for short. You can learn more about it at responsiblemining.net.
Awesome.
There are a lot of standards out there and a lot of other initiatives that are focused on single supply chains or particular issues. And with IRMA, we tried to aggregate all of those concerns into one standard that could cover all forms of metals mining. Our third demand and final demand is that we need to build a future that is acknowledging climate constraints. And that means that investments in new areas should focus less on mining new minerals and focus less on an assumption of everybody having their own single car, and focus more instead on more other types of transit, mass transit and bike transit. We need to assume that we're not going to be able to continue consuming at the same level that we've been able to consume. And that's a demand more for the financial sector and institutions like the World Bank to really make sure that we're directing future investments away from some of these risky practices and towards a more sustainable future.
Thank you, Jennifer. Robert, how would you describe the awareness level in the automobile manufacturer's perspective about concerns over batteries, and what do you think, what are some of the things the industry is thinking about, recyclability or second use options? Can you give us a little perspective on that?
Sure. So the recycling as it is today is a quite diverse story. So just ask yourself, when you take your remote from your TV and the battery, the 2 cells you got in there are drained, do you bring them back to the recycling where the battery needs to go, or do you just throw it in the trash as anything else you have in your household? We experience that not a lot of people bring in these tiny battery cells, which have a sort of nickel and cadmium percentage in there, back to the recycling facility where we can do some stuff with it. In order, like Jennifer described, to compensate for new mining, we need to address the recycling in a more serious way. Today, people don't recycle very happily, and being from California, I know Californians try hard. I've been to Tennessee, and they took me to Lookout Mountain, and you can see down the Lookout Mountain where people just tossing their fridge and whatnot down the ridge there. So it's just like, okay, that's the way of their recycling over there. So 50 states, 50 way different laws and applications on how to do recycling. The maybe not a role model, but in a certain way a different approach is European Union, which is quite strict on those regulations, not only for OEMs, but anybody who has a battery in circulation, including smartphones, iPhones, and whatnot. So maybe that is an approach to force through regulations in that way. What we do for us as a target in the US is at least reach something that is about 97% recycling quote out of the battery. It's not there yet today, for sure. Like I said, the issue is still that people do something else with the tech and not recycle it in the proper way. One really great thing to tackle right now would be the insurance companies, and we're talking to them quite often. What happens today? You take in your car, and that can be a Volkswagen, can be a Tesla, can be whatever brand you have in mind, and you're driving over like a rock or a boulder. And there was this one scenario which is quite standing out. One guy is taking this car, was an e-Golf, down the road, and was, for whatever reason, switching the lanes and going into the upcoming traffic by riding through the median, and then hit the rocks and the boulders, and the battery was quite dented from the undershell. It's reinforced steel, so it's nothing to worry about. But then the insurance company was writing off the vehicle. So the battery is still good. It's still good in its performance. Yes, it looks nasty from the undershell, but the undershell, there's a repair procedure for it. So we can actually fix it. But the insurance company was not interested whatsoever. So they said the car is totaled, has a zero value, and not even given the chance to fix it. So what happens? They take them to a scrap metal yard somewhere in any state in the US, and then they just get rid of it, then give it to a recycling company who does something with it. It's out of our hands, nobody knows. It's out of the customer hands because it's owned by an insurance company. So that would be actually something where we can do some very good things, using these batteries for something else. And I got this one picture I can pull up if you want to. It's
Sure.
the one with the recycling circle around the Volkswagen battery.
Nate, can you pull that up?
Yeah, that would be awesome. That just walks briefly about what we have in mind there. Yep, that's one. So as you see on the top, a battery cell is something we heavily invest in. And this battery cell, X amount of battery cells assemble a battery module, and X amount of battery modules assemble a battery system. It's the skateboard design or chocolate bar design or whatever you want to call it. When you're jumping into this life cycle onto point number 4, you see the rest of life decision, the so-called SOH, state of health. Is this battery still good or not? And in our e-Golf scenario with the poor guy denting the battery there is a chance to repair it, and we can repair everything within this battery system. And if we can repair it, customers again happy, back on the road, and we just cause minimum content and technology we have to then recycle, in our case, because it was damaged. And for our case, that would be just a steel shell. So that is almost like 100% recycling quote. So that is easy. The next step in order to compensate for the mining, like Jennifer described, would be the repurposing. So first you repair, then you repurpose, and then you recycle. And if we follow that order, we can just have a lot of good car batteries used to do something different than just being in a vehicle. The recycling then results into the black mass, which is something we can talk about another time. That's a huge different market.
Thank you, Robert.
That's great. And that repurpose really is, I think, a big part of this story as well. I regularly remind folks that EV batteries are still at the minimum, 70% of their capacity is left when they're done being used in your car. And there are escalators all over the country and all over the world being powered by EV batteries. There are data centers currently being backed up by EV batteries. Amazon has one of them. Renault uses EV batteries across their different manufacturing cycles. So there really is a significant reuse here. And in addition to how I'm seeing OEMs really drive the reusability market and making sure there is that second place market that's really thriving, I'm also seeing steps that the OEM is taking as well to increase transparency throughout the supply chain. And I think that's big for all of the people in the country and the world who want to go electric. So could you talk, Robert, a little bit more about that?
Yes, in 2015, Volkswagen launched this campaign where we introduced a audit process to every cell manufacturer. The picture we showed before introduced on the left side the cell. So the cell is today something we buy in as a material, right? On the battery cell is something we buy in as a material. And we making sure through this annual audit process that this for sure is any child labor involved, this company would not been selected. And if there would be any waste or hazardous scenarios with the environment involved, this company would not be selected. So that is something we give ourselves as a task and do through the audit, the most transparent, pretty much OEM you can find right now on that field.
Thank you.
I think it's called the responsible, or one of them is called the Responsible Sourcing Blockchain Network, in case any of our viewers want to look into that at any point.
Correct.
A lot of questions that we receive, you know, we cover it sometimes in our Ask an EV Owner events or EV myth busting is, you know, what's the real lifespan of electric car battery? You know, you see warranties, 8 years, 100,000 miles. What does that mean? Like after 8 years, the car doesn't run anymore, or can you just help us understand that?
Oh, sure. We started with that in our discussion. The assumptions we know from 120 years design of a piston rod engine, a combustion gas explosion engine, is something we need to reconsider for the EV. So for instance, you have the same car, Chevy Tahoe, whatever reason, you got this car and that has about 100,000 miles on the odometer, and then you pretty much have like a good guesstimate what the engine is all about. Maybe it failed the compression test, maybe not. Maybe this car, and sometimes people refer it as been driven by an old timer. Maybe this car was, you know, like cold crank and driven like a 5-mile range to the next Walmart and then switched off again in Alaska, so a low temperature. And then you're doing the same way back to your home. We know that the engine suffered a lot over its lifetime. So we know that pretty much a car and the engine is not good anymore as maybe whatever car that has been seen some long distance road trip and was idling and being warmed up and stuff like that through driving for sure. And there's a different approach now on EVs. We know for sure the brakes are not an issue whatsoever because usually you don't use hydraulic brakes to slow down an EV. You take the electric machine, which is a motor if you drive it, and which is a generator when you decelerate it, slowing down. And you have no clutch, so that part does not go wrong, and you have no transmission, so that part does not go wrong. So from the dealership perspective, it's challenging for sure, because now we need to talk about new business models for the dealers. They are out there, so it's not a frightening scenario, but needs to be covered. The battery itself was designed, like I said, when I started out in 2006, pretty much by us in the first phase as Volkswagen. Back in 2006, there was not a real competitor around. The only car as a reference in the field, in the market, Toyota Prius. And with that Toyota Prius, and we for sure did some testing, as any other OEM checks the benchmark. And that's about it. So we designed pretty much everything from scratch in 2006 with a very conservative assumptions. And now about 14 years later, we know that our conservative assumptions were very conservative. So we know that the battery after 8 or 10 years is very unlikely to hit an SOH state of health of 60 or 70%. So we can anticipate it's going to be much higher. It always depends on who was driving it and which way. That's why sometimes you drive an EV and it gives you with the HMI, the display, a indication that your battery life will run out faster if you keep charging to full. Your battery life will run out faster if you just use like 10% from the top of the battery cell and not like the full extent of the battery cell.
Supposedly that's the same with our cell phones too. We're supposed to drain the battery.
Yes, and that's the same thing with a car. You gotta visualize the thing like a bodybuilder, you know, like Arnold. You gotta use the entire muscle and arm, and with that range, you use really the entire battery cell to a certain point, and that is the best way you can work on the battery cell in that way. If you just have a lazy battery, and that term is really lazy battery, you use like 10% from the top, the battery gets lazy. You experience the same effect with your laptop. If you leave it in the docking station fully charged for a month and then you uncouple, Yeah,
never
right.
do
You would
that.
never. Now we know. But pretty much at the beginning, people did so, and then the battery was bad, and it's still a good laptop. But yeah, it's half a year old, and the batteries won't run out. So that's the same scenario here.
Good analogy.
If our IT department is watching this, I'm sorry.
Right. Just one supplement on that. We know that the battery's been stressed in the vehicle. Like I said, it's got to run in Anchorage in the wintertime. It's got to run in Death Valley in the summertime. We know that when you take out the car from the vehicle as a repurpose scenario, it will easily do another 10 to 15 years. So the repurposing going to be something we need to talk about in the next session, I guess, maybe in 2 years, because by that time there would be maybe sufficient volume. Right now we don't see it yet. There are hardly any EVs going wrong because of the battery.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. That's good insight. I think we got about 15 minutes to go. We want to get to some specific audience questions. Blair, do you want to take one?
Jennifer, thank you. You've been going through our Q&A to make sure we can tackle as many as we can. And I know you've answered a couple of this in writing, but I do want to flag it for an entire audience. Everyone really seems interested in the calculations that you guys did in terms of, what are those percentages that we need to see. And I want to flag for everybody, how those calculations might be impacted by increases in recycling technology and, potential technological breakthroughs.
Yeah. Those were really good questions from the audience. And more details can be found at earthworks.org at our website. The full report is available there. What we looked at, what the University of Technology Sydney looked at when analyzing mineral demand was what is our current availability for recyclability. So lithium is a pretty obvious example. Our current demand for lithium is in electronics, not a whole lot else. So there just isn't a volume of lithium that's available to recycle, even if we had maximized recycling, in order to meet EV demand. The coming EV demand, if we approach if we even get part of the way towards 100% EV penetration, is just going to require a lot more lithium than is currently available. We also modeled scenarios with technology development and advancements. We looked at likelihood of new battery technologies that have been proposed but are not yet out at scale. We looked at different demand scenarios for nickel as well, because an alternative to a lithium battery is a nickel-based battery, and some nickel is used in the current EV battery market as well. We looked at cobalt, where you can have also chemistry design that reduces the demand for cobalt considerably. So the scenarios that we modeled didn't come up with a fixed number. We are going to use X amount of cobalt. What they came up with was a range based on reasonable availability of technology and reasonable availability. Oh, thanks, Nate. Reasonable availability of technology and reasonable availability of recyclability. And so what those maximum and minimum scenario ranges amount to was modeling of what was available, of what we know might be available. And we were looking specifically at the 2050 timeframe. We asked about 2050 because we asked the models to use the 2050 scenario because that's what our climate scenarios often come to. Many corporate commitments around climate, many governmental commitments around climate, renewable portfolio standards, et cetera, use a 2050 scenario. So we wanted to put that to test as well.
That's great. Thank you. Here's a question. Can someone speak to the reuse of battery packs for energy storage? We often hear like that's a second use option. And the question says their understanding is that it's not as straightforward as it sounds. It sounds very good, but it's actually a little bit more difficult to make happen because the batteries might have different level of capacity left in them. Any sense? Is that something that needs a lot more work, or is it already on us now?
I can speak to that. So Yes, so that's a brilliant idea. That's exactly what we have in mind as well. Like I said, the car needs to work in Alaska and it needs to work in Death Valley. So there's a lot of tension within the battery when you have it in an operational, non-stationary movement. If you take the same battery out of the vehicle and put it in a stationary scenario, which can be in your basement, in your attic, as a shelf in your driveway, you name it. So you can just, whatever angle you find, whatever space you can fill with those batteries in your home, you'll be fine with that very, very battery. And the technology itself, keep in mind, it's quite ancient. We have this car of Mr. Edison standing next to it, if you want to pull up that picture. And I always love the phrase of the history book on the shelf is always repeating itself. That's actually the case even for EVs. Back in 1911 in Detroit, there were more EVs on the road than cars with a combustion engine.
Wow.
So it's all been there. And the question usually comes, what happens to the EVs? Why wasn't it used anymore? Yeah, the only reason is you can fill up gas very fast and then get going again back in those days. So a fast charge for those 1,000-mile battery run by Mr. Edison, or the next page, please, of that car being charged somewhere, and that's actually in Berlin, has never been a scenario back in those days because there was no fast charge option. When the EVs were running out, the only scenario was for ambulances to take those cars because the doctor can hop on the car and then just keep going. You don't have to crank the combustion engine and then get shaky hands and trying to hold then medical tools to rescue the person. So that was a reason why for those guys. And that's about it. To your point, the battery is quite known, and we anticipate a lot of lifetime from the battery when it's been not good for the car anymore in a stationary scenario. So that's going to be something very easily to cover. You just need another, we call it HEMS, Home Energy Management System, which is a battery control unit for different modules. And we actually daisy chain different modules to whatever we need. For us in the US, like 60 Hertz and 110 volts, and then you want to do something with it at your house. So that's MacGyverism poor, and it's actually working. That's what we did in 2011 with the twin drive concept. Your home, your car powers your home through a battery that has been a repurposed battery.
That's
great.
awesome.
So it's all there.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, thank you, Charles, for sending in that question. We appreciate you joining us. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and there's a question that is really, or two questions that are really near and dear to my heart and that are important to me as an environmentalist, and I want us to have enough time to really get into the weeds and talk about them. So we announced a poll, or we launched a poll at the beginning of this event. Are concerns around EV batteries holding you back from purchasing an electric car? So I'm sharing those results right now. And what we see is about 20% of folks, at least on this webinar, but I think that's probably a fair applicable standard, that they're really worried about this technology, and you have every right to be really worried. Where we want to make sure to address those concerns is that there are still ways to go electric right now, and there's things that we can all do as EV owners and EV advocates to really take the opportunity to advocate for change here and make a better future. And so, Jennifer, my questions to you first, and then Robert, I'd love if you could add in is, should we be waiting to go electric right now? And, how can people like those of us on this call, EV enthusiasts, use this opportunity to advocate for change?
My advice to the question of should we go electric now, despite knowing what we know about these impacts, is that if you are planning to buy a new vehicle, then you should buy an electric vehicle now. I know these are significant impacts. These impacts exist with internal combustion engine vehicles as well. With an EV, you reduce the impacts from dependence on oil, and that's the main reason for various reasons, that's the reason I got into it. If environmental impacts are something that you're worried about, then you should be very worried about the environmental impacts of our dependence on oil. I would say you should buy an EV now, and you should be mindful of these very significant issues. Watch alternatives, watch what's happening in your local region when it comes to advancing battery recycling technology, and take advantage of participating in the clean energy transition as an opportunity to clean up the mining industry. We
Absolutely.
have the ability right now, because our demand is poised to be so strong. We have outsized power. Historically, you don't usually get moments like this. Often when we're talking about environmental impacts, we're talking about impacts about a technology or an industry that have already happened. The pollution is there, and a super fund is created, or an initiative is created, or a new policy is created to clean up that pollution or prevent future pollution, because we know that there is an impact. Here, we have the opportunity to write a different story. We have an opportunity to prevent these impacts before they happen, to clean up an industry that we know was dirty when it came to internal combustion engine vehicles, and to use our leverage as EV purchasers, as EV manufacturers, to demand that things are done better with this new technology.
Thank you. Or goosebumps, I swear, every time. Robert, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm driving EV since 2011 full time, and I was one of the early adopters. And back in these days, it was more of a challenge and MacGyverism to get energy into your car. If you consider buying a new car, really look into EVs and what is your anticipation of being mobile, being driving around. And if that is an average daily driving range of about 42 miles, you're fine with an EV. So if you're driving around 42 miles plus minus a day, you can be fine with an EV. A lot of people approach us and say, "Oh, but I got to go on a road trip to my sister-in-law." And yeah, where's she? Yeah, she's living out in Nebraska, and I got to drive from California. So how often do you drive there? Yeah, maybe like once a year. Okay, so yes, you'll be fine with an EV. But people that's a natural thing, I guess. People think of very often of scenarios. Why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I? And then, yeah, just give it a shot. The one fact for Volkswagen that keeps me happy is whenever people got behind the wheel of an electric vehicle, there was not a single customer worldwide, not only the US and Canada, but worldwide, that gave back the key of the electric car and say like, I'm done with it. Give me back my Golf R or my whatever SUV. Never happened. So the issue will be you're gonna get hooked and you're gonna be addicted to that. And it's more fun to drive. It's more reliable, and it's a very smooth drive. There's no vibrations, no noise, no fumes, no exhaust. It's just awesome. So that's what got me hooked in 2011. I'm still driving EV.
So
and no gas stations.
Oh yeah.
And no gas stations, and no oil spots in your driveway, and
yep.
There's lots of benefits there. We want to thank you guys. We're about out of time. Jennifer and Robert, thank you so much. You guys are clearly experts, and you explain complicated and sensitive topics, I think, really clearly. So we appreciate you being with us today. Today's Monday. Generation 180 has a whole week of events this week lined up. Tonight we have EV myth busting. We have charging at work, EV policies. We have a lot of EV conversions. We have a lot of great events coming up for the rest of the week. So we hope to see everyone who joined today on some of those future events. And again, Robert and Jennifer, thank you so much for being on our panel today.
Yeah, thank you guys. And for all those who asked, yes, this event will be recorded, and we will post the recordings to all of our events after the week. And I have just posted the link for the entire week of events if you're interested. It's also the National Solar Tour this week, so there's a lot going on. It's a busy, busy time. You will see me heavily caffeinated by the end of this week if you stick around for all 13 events. So please do join us, and thank you guys.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Good
Thank you
afternoon.
for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.